Ed Knox tried stern admonition to limit this introduction to 90 seconds. Protesting that I speak as slowly as I think, I worked him up grudgingly to 2 minutes. Now, however, I can break my pledge, and there isn't a lot that Ed can do about it. I can save some time by summarizing his 38 years at the college. Ed has been everything that it is possible for a faculty member and administrator to be, from acting assistant professor of French to acting president of the college. Along the way, directing the Middlebury language schools for 10 years, guest professoring at the Sorbonne, and all the while publishing scholarly books, language textbooks, and most recently, numerous articles on French-American relations. Clearly, Ed has now attained his highest rank, acting retirement. And that's fitting. Eminent administrators and teachers need to be great actors, whether they admit it or not. Especially so when they have made an institutional commitment as deep, as lasting, and as constructive as Ed's. Everyone here has benefited from Ed's ability to foresee contingencies. It's remarkable. To say nothing of his timeliness, clarity, and sheer labor. I should note, however, that Ed has been alleged to have had, on occasion, a sharp tongue. I have felt it more than once, but his barbs have never been personal. They emerge only when an incisive wake-up call is needed. Every time after the sting has subsided, I've had to admit, to myself only, of course, that Ed was absolutely right. I trust Ed is now mellowed enough in his acting retirement to pardon me one more transgression. An introducer who knows only one thing about the subject that he is introducing is psychologically compelled to parade it. So here is my offering. For the first 50 years of the Republic's existence, Americans assumed that liberty and equality were compatible, even complementary goals that every citizen could attain. Then came the following 4 sentences in Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Democratic communities have a natural taste for freedom. Left to themselves, they will seek it, cherish it, and view any privation of it with regret. But for equality, their passion is ardent, insatiable, incessant, and invincible. They call for equality in freedom, and if they cannot obtain that, they still call for equality in slavery. They will endure poverty, servitude, barbarism, but they will not endure aristocracy. Whether Americans do love equality more than liberty remains debatable. But Tocqueville showed that liberty and equality cannot grow together. More liberty means less equality. More equality means less liberty. The two goals exist in inverse proportion, and Americans cannot have it both ways. Tocqueville's words are an insight many have wanted to forget, but American history can plausibly be divided into alternating periods of sacrificing equality to liberty, and then vice versa. My point is that it was only an outsider, perhaps only a Frenchman whose parents had suffered terribly during the Revolution. Liberté, égalité, et fraternité, who could have arrived at that particular and important truth. Parade over. feel free to rain on it. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce my colleague and my friend, Ed Knox. His talk today is titled American Writing on France, Plus ça change. Please welcome.
This on? Well, in conclusion, that was the longest 90-second introduction. Normally I'd be intimidated following Tocqueville and John McWilliams, but fortunately for me, everyone in this room has already figured out what they think of me, so I'm scot-free. I'm all scot-free. There's no problem. Thank you, John. Thanks to Middlebury College for supporting the research I'll be talking about, to Brian Fung for doing much of the research, to Eric and Harvey and Thierry Warin for helping me with the PowerPoint. And when I say help, that's a gross understatement. Keith Conkin for bibliographical things. Scott Witt for turning up the volume. How are we doing? Is that all right? Yep. Okay. Thanks to the terrific staff of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs, Charlotte, Martha, Carol Ann. Thanks, as always, to Huguette for keeping me honest. And last but not least, my deepest thanks for the invitation to speak to the acting director of the Rohatyn Center. Like many of you, I do wish Carol Riffle could be here. She enlivens everything she participates in, and she's very much in our thoughts, I think. So today, what I want to do is an update, at least for myself, on what one can say about American writing on France over about 5 years. It's an update for me because some of you heard me talk about how the New York Times looks at France and other sojourner writing, but this is a later period and involves, in some ways, the war in Iraq. This talk has a serious bibliographical dimension. There is a handout if you didn't pick it up. You may need it, although I'm going to be running through pretty quickly, but that's just for interest, I think. What I'd like to do is a brief summary of what I think is the situation, the lay of the land, serve you up a lot of quotes to give you a sense of the motifs and things that run through these texts, and then some concluding remarks. Generally, it's no secret that the U.S. is not particularly international in its interests, but within the body of writing on other countries, France occupies a prominent place, as it does in travel, American travel. Compared to writing about other countries, there's a lot of American writing. Second point, it is sharply divided, pro and con. And I think if you look at the titles and subtitles in the bibliography, you'll see that that's not simply a convenient way of dividing. This literature is almost bipolar in terms of liking and not liking. On the positive side, it runs basically to what I would call the personal and the cultural affection for traditional France, for village France, for the cultural life in Paris, and the quality of everyday life. On the negative side, it tends to run more to the public and the political spheres, historical spheres, international relations, and what's perceived to be a French antipathy toward the United States. During the period that I'm talking about, the positive writing continued on with almost no reference to the war in Iraq, which I think is interesting. The themes I've outlined before, the themes in this kind of literature have to do with fixing up a home, or learning to cook French style, or mastering the French language, to a point anyway. And that continues on in this literature. The two new wrinkles, I think, in the positive are a large number of anthologies and a lot of internet activity, which strikes me as new even since the last time I looked at this literature. On the negative side, none of you will have trouble remembering all of the alleged jokes and snide comments in 2002, 2003, which I won't rehearse, but there were 5 books, there may be more, I found 5, highly negative on France that I'll evoke a little bit later. But since 2004 or so, after looking at these books, I looked at news coverage of various events in France. And to me, the news coverage has been increasingly more informative, less condescending, less hostile. My perhaps facile interpretation of that is people decided France was more right than wrong about Iraq, and so maybe it wasn't as easy to make fun of them as it had been previously. So let's look at if I can get this to work, let's look at a certain number of these texts. Hope you can all see them. France is, first of all, in the positive literature, a special place. So Green talks about a house, a presbytery that has been, that they have redone, but this sense of history. We're just passing through here. Espinasse hears her kid starting to learn French and to speak better the French than she does, and so she starts a blog talking about French and words that people might be interested in, and it becomes a book after that. This is probably the point to say the French in this literature is wrong. Almost every time people use French in their text, there's a problem with it. And I don't know what the editors, or even the writers are doing, but it's full of errors. You may remember Gopnik's book, which is one of the most admired, Paris to the Moon. Half of the French is wrong in this book. But he goes on about conversations he's had with all these, they all do it, conversations with other people. You wonder what kind of conversation they can have if every time they write French on a paper, every other time it's wrong. Haller is a cook. He gets into French cooking, but the cooking leads to a book, which I think is a fairly typical experience, just the way fixing up a house seems to lead to a book. The child quote, this is Julia Child, and she talks about learning. Hers is the only real memoir. The other books I would call chronicles, in other words, a year or events. Hers is a real memoir. It covers a lifetime and a career, what she sees as a life-changing experience. But what I like about this quote is the burst of flavor, because it seems to me that that's a metaphor for almost all of these people who go to France. France gives them a jolt, a shock, a burst of flavor. And then the Standards quote, I think, is fairly typical, where he says, these experiences make you feel you belong. In other words, there's a kind of initiation or a challenge to be gotten over, and if you can show that you are some way able to function, it's a very satisfying experience. Now, it's also a special moment, I think. Sanders talks about his stay in France being a time out of time. Spector says you have the freedom from other restraints to do things differently. Child, again, is talking about a period of transformation in which I found my true calling. And Gershman goes on about those who are able to adjust are changed forever and usually choose to stay or to return when possible. So that there's a kind of tipping point phenomenon, I think, with a lot of these people where they come out of this experience more self-aware and also a kind of new self, as they say in some cases. Green sees a chance to reinvent himself. Gershman, who is a widow, goes to France for a change of scenery, so to speak, talks about the happiest version of the new me. Gershman's an interesting case because she is a businesswoman. She's been to France many times to do business. She comes back to buy an apartment and set up, and she finds the experience totally different, which, of course, it is. Loomis is referring here, we were all at home together. Loomis is referring to a Thanksgiving dinner that she held where they invited French friends in. And the notion of being at home in France, I think, is important. Florent, in the next text, is an American who marries a Frenchman. There are a certain number of these cases, all women who marry French men. They got it wrong. What can I say? But he too is talking about. She is talking about right there in the heart of the family with everybody else. And then look at the Morgan at the bottom. Morgan is one of the two people. Loomis is the other who refers to the war at some point. All of this was while our friends at home were being told that the French hate Americans. And as many, we had people ask us whether they dare go to France during the war in Iraq. We said, sure. At the people level, it's not a problem. And so this is what Morgan notices too. So I mentioned there are a lot of anthologies. It seems to me not just on France. There are a lot of travel anthologies. I think it has to do with the fact that there's a lot more travel now, globalization, etc. And France falls into that quite well. France occupies a large part, France and Paris, a large part of these anthologies, probably the largest share of them. What the anthologies talk about are the power of seduction and plays, the art of living well, eating well, love and romance, the chance to get away from the ordinary, Paris as the place that matters, finding one's own identity in another place. So France comes across as a kind of what I would call a haven of quality in these texts. So when O'Reilly talks about creeping homogeneity, he's saying that this is what globalization is bringing, and this is what a stay in France can get you away from, is this homogeneity. It's interesting because in almost none of these texts is there any reflection on the fact that theoretically there's a level where if all these Americans or Germans or Brits are restoring houses in a village, sooner or later the village is not going to be the village you came to live in because it'll be changed by your presence. They don't talk about that. I mentioned a haven of quality. This is Gopnik in the wait a minute, what happened there? Third down. Okay, right. Yeah, sorry. So Sanders is talking about the world having lost its way. This is again the globalization phenomenon, where mistaking complexity for goodness, costliness for quality, etc. Gopnik is in this theme as well, because in his introduction, which is a very interesting introduction to his anthology, he talks about the epiphanies, the first sighting, the first meal, the first morning. And the Olivier quote, this is not an anthology, but it goes very much to the same place, where she says the French girl unequivocally owns her own life and her own body, and she takes care of both. It's interesting because Olivier wrote her book 2 years before Guiliano wrote her French Women Don't Get Fat, which got a lot more play. But there are predecessors to this, and this would be her case. And so Sanders talks early in the book about the modern world having lost its way, and by the end of the book, he's concerned because he sees that the place where he is living is being restored to an inch of its life and becoming a vacation colony. So there are, in some cases, signs of change. In other words, this positive literature has, in a sense, depends on a rather fixed notion of a traditional France, but there are some signs of change. Going to the internet, you have websites, you have blogs, and it's interesting because they're tending to mesh. The websites were set up basically as information for people who want to travel to France. Blogs are more personal. The websites are becoming more personal, and the blogs are becoming more informational, I think. This is Polly Platt's. Polly Platt's the author of a book called French or Faux, which it's kind of a cult classic among some people. It's basically a commercial site, and she only has 2 pictures of herself on the site, but you can see basically where she's trying to go with it in tips and so to speak, everything you need to know about day life in France. When you get to blogs, this is just one blog. You have, let's see if I can do this. I can do this. Where is it? Let me get this down here. Come on. Just so we can play with it. So over here, you've got earlier chronicles. This is the interactive part where people are writing. Here she's quoting Gopnik. She doesn't know how to spell Hemingway. She doesn't know how to spell Gopnik, but that's all right. This is typical, French, so foreign. There's something ineffable about the French, so dependably ineffable, this kind of thing. But look at the subtitle. Don't hate me because I live in Paris. I thought I knew what that meant, and I realized its ambiguity. It could be, don't be overly envious of me, and therefore hate me because I have the... It also may mean, the Iraq War is on, don't hate me because I'm here. I'm not sure what it means. But this is typical blog. The blog site of blogs says, when I last looked, said there are 150 American blogs about life in France. I confess to an epidermal reaction to these blogs. I can't stand to read them. they are important at some level. They would be a great senior project, frankly, to my colleagues in French. I mean, to try to have a student, because I think it's a generational thing, basically say why you should read them, I guess. And finally, this is a website called Miquelon. And he set it up very specifically in 2003, I think, to counter all of the criticism of France that surrounded the beginning of the war in Iraq. And it has all sorts of things going on. You can see at the top how many things there are. Educating French bashers one day at a time. The thrust of what he's trying to do, and these references are in the handout. What he's trying to do is replace the fact that it's now a cliche. There is no French lobby in this country. There's no body of French immigrants. There's nobody pushing back when France is criticized, and so he took it on himself. And it's a very extensive website, and I think you might enjoy looking at it. Okay, what is he bothered by? Well, he was bothered by our war with France. Some of you may remember Tom Friedman's article. That was the title of it. And what I wanted to stress here is the intensity of some of this writing, the invective in many cases. They're talking about hatred. They're talking about jealousy. They're talking about a long-standing antipathy between the two countries as they see it. If you look at the third one, the French have failed to realize that the United States does not pose, and in fact never has posed, a threat to the country. There's a one-sidedness to this, that America is just out to protect its interest, and that's normal, and basically if it defends its own interest, that's in the interest of the Western world, and this sort of thing. Next quote, active subversion of America's right to self-defense. We know in retrospect that self-defense was maybe an overstatement where Iraq was concerned. But there's a kind of double standard at work, or an asymmetry, so that the two countries are not put on the same footing, and it starts from America. And the last quote, no allied nation infuriates Americans more these days than France in its relentless, often irrational campaign to deprecate almost everything American. Impotent or not, France and the French continue to plot against America. So you've got a constant war by the French. Its historical anger starts with the period just after the American Revolution, and says you can see this French antipathy, hostility, disloyalty since then, all the way through history, and finds it an irrational campaign. Which, I mean, there is an irrationalness involved here, but I'm not sure he's put it in the right place. And then the theme of impotent or not, which you find many times, and it's sort of a paradox because many of these authors say, well, I mean, uppity would be the term. Where does France get off? France is not important. They're a second-rate country. But they keep saying it. So if you have to keep saying it, then it probably isn't true. In other words, if you have to keep putting down France, then maybe it's not where you think it is. There's a level of, I think, national cultural insecurity, I think, that involves it. So I quote Chesnov, why are the French so damn French? He talks about deceit, exploitation, animosity on the part of the French, and naivete and indifference on the part of America. So we come off fine. Chesnov is really interesting, I think. Why did the French so treacherously turn their backs on us in our wars against terror? Why was that waiter in your Paris restaurant so insultingly arrogant? Why are the French so damn French? So it's all of a piece, right? The waiter that you feel snubbed you is the same as at the UN, Villepin at the UN, this kind. It's all of a piece. And I think what you really see here so often is that France is essentialized. It's made a person. It behaves like a petulant person. It behaves like a jealous person. And so there's no real difference between the French and France, which is not the way the French would look at. It's rather very different from the way the French would look at America, I think. Boyle says, France's punishment for a history and deceit and treachery is to be France, a shrinking power. So that's, again, the idea that they're no longer that important. But I'd say if you have to keep insisting on it, there's something wrong with the way you're looking at it. Chesnov, in a different mode, they have as much right to pass solemn judgment on modern world events as, say, modern Greece might claim because of its past glories. This theme that France is still working out the fact that it's no longer a world power or whatever. And this last quote is very interesting, I think, from Watts. Watts takes the period John McWilliams was talking about, which is 1780 to 1860, more or less. So he says, basically, the war with the French in the New World is over. America is expanding, and he looks at these texts and how people talk about the French mode, because as America moves west, they're encountering in the French. The French are all through the Middle West at this point because they come. That's their route of exploration down the Mississippi, etc. So when they expand, they run into Indians, but they also run into many French people, and they're trying to sort this out. And the book sees a whole set of values that they see as French rather than English or Anglo-American. And very interesting. It says that they have, as he says, more on subjects such as land, race, gender, religion, and nation. And much of the rhetoric is the same here about French being ineffective or disloyal or Indian lovers, this kind of thing. It's a very interesting historical look at these issues. Okay, so tight on time, as I assume. It's your fault because you went over the 90 seconds. I told you not to do that. Just a quick run through some events. Heat wave in 2003, 2 articles. Tagliabue wrote a good article on it. I mean, it was complex. What happened? The heat wave occurred in August, so hospitals are understaffed. People are away on vacation, didn't necessarily bring grandma with them on vacation. She stayed back in Paris where it was really hot, no air conditioning. So there's a kind of perfect storm aspect to this. Tagliabue really outlines it very well. And what this reminds us, I think, is the people who write these articles almost never put the headline on there. Somebody else is doing the headline, trying to grab the interest or flatter the stereotypes that the reader, or they think the reader, carries with him or her. The second is rather more typical. Pity the French, but they deserve their miseries. In other words, in so many ways, the French just asked for it, and so we're justified in slapping them down. Too quickly, the ban on religious symbols in schools, I found quite reasonably dealt with. It's a very tough issue for Americans to get at, which is French secularism, Republican separation of religion and state, church and state. And the articles, I thought, dealt pretty well with it. Same thing when we come to... No, we don't. How do I get that far? That's interesting. All right. You were just spared a page. I don't know what happened to it. But basically, in between 2005, the riots in the suburbs or the outer cities in France, there was a lot of criticism, but this is, I guess, one of my main points. There's a lot of criticism, and that's not the same thing as bashing. And so there were people saying that the French really don't understand why people are rioting in the outer cities, that if the unemployment was not so high, if labor laws encouraged employers to hire, etc., it would be a much better situation. But there wasn't this business about they deserve it, serves them right, this kind of clucking or schadenfreude over the French situation. Okay, let's see. Where we go now? Okay, more typical titles. Who Moved My Fromage, which is, it's really good when you see a French word inserted into an American headline. It's going to be some needling. Vive la dolce vita. What this refers to, another thing, a stream that runs through this literature, is the French are self-indulgent. In other words, they get 5 weeks of vacation, like the other countries in Europe. But it's France that gets knocked for it. 35-hour work week. They don't want to work. Well, the French are more productive than Americans are. It's just that the Americans work so much longer that they produce more. But the French are more productive on an hourly basis. You almost never see that in the articles. So the theme of indulgence, and I think a lot of these themes are English before, and they were taken over American. But Catholics are notoriously self-indulgent. They can get pardoned by the Pope, and so the English look down on them and find this wherever they can find it. And the 35-hour week is simply confirmation of that sorry trait. But what's happening here, if you look at the last 2 quotes, is both USA Today and FAF and the International Herald Tribune is saying when you look at the whole issue of work, contracts, employment, etc., they are increasingly world issues and not simply French issues, and should be looked at that way. Okay, presidential elections, a little bit early because, as you know, we aren't finished. There will be a roundtable on the French elections a week from Friday. Again, very sober, straightforward coverage, at least is what I've seen up until now for the most part. And, for example, the Wall Street Journal is censorious about French ways, but much less nasty, it seemed to me, this spring than it would have been in the past. You know, you don't get the business about cradle-to-grave welfare and all the things that go with that and not wanting to work. This quote is interesting because Mitt Romney's team did a memo and said one part of your strategy should be first, not France, meaning set yourself out, make sure people know that you're not like France, and Hillary is like France. This is what you do. And this is how the Boston Globe reacted to it, you know, saying, duh, you know. But what they're saying is, this moment, maybe you could make this fly in 2003. You can't make it fly now, which I find that's very interesting. That said, Cohen in the International Herald Tribune, you got to love the French. There's a lot of articles talking, oh, there they go again, or only in France. You know, forever the land of bread and roses in which reality and reverie mingle. Unlike the United States, for example, which is always dead on and no wishful thinking. Roger Cohen and John Vanoker in the International Herald Tribune and sometimes picked up in the Times are the most consistently hypercritical of France. I think they both live in France. Cohen maybe not. They know a lot about France, but they can't do a straight article. I mean, their columns it's not an Associated Press article, but they always put this kind of filter at the top, and it's not necessarily the title. It's the lead. It's the first paragraph, which makes sure to get the right angle on what's going to follow. And this is Cohen saying that, well, you know, they really don't think things through. They don't have their feet on the ground. Trueheart in the Atlantic. This is the same, almost contemporary. You know, France is mired in an antiquated economic and social system, overtaxed, overregulated, underemployed, underproductive, congenitally immobile when not sporadically violent. Well, congenitally means it's essentializing. They behave like the French behave like a petulant child or a spoiled brat or whatever. You know, it's in them. It's not something acquired. Overtaxed, overregulated, underemployed, underproductive. So what's the norm? I mean, if it's over, what's right on? Let's see. There must be some other country that's the norm. I know it's America. That would be the norm. Overtaxed compared to what? You know, this is the kind of thing that you get quite a bit. So, plus ça change? I don't know. You know, it's very difficult to characterize this much writing to say that it's really changing. It's easy to cherry pick. Let me show you how you cherry pick. Here's. Some of you may remember the first one. That's a front page New York Times book review on a book by a Frenchman who had come to the United States and whose book was really quite favorable to the United States. There was a lot of fantasy to it. I mean, it was whimsical in many cases and kind of over the top in many cases, but it was fundamentally favorable to Americans. This is the way Garrison Keillor, you know, it sounds like elementary school, and this is on the front page of the Times Book Review. Cohen again. Now, what this means? What this means is the U.S. seems curiously impervious to French knowledge. He's using it properly. What he means is the French can't know the United States, that the United States is impenetrable to French knowledge because the French prefer to preserve the country in the realm of the imaginary. Again, unlike Americans who see right through France and understand it perfectly. I should add, in October we'll have a presentation on what is anti-Americanism, so it'll be a little bit a balance to these two presentations. So in the end, how to relate to France, I think, is a question that runs through this. And it's not completely answered yet. Florent, again, married a Frenchman. We were married in both cultures. They have a wedding in both countries, and both are quite funny, actually. It's a fun read. Chesnov, a lot of the most critical people on France live in France. And there's more than one way to interpret that, I guess. But I personally find the quality of my day-to-day life in France far superior to anything that I could afford back home in the USA. Then at the end of his book, he has a list of the French firms that people should boycott, and a whole list of expressions to use on rude French people. So he's enjoying life in France, but don't let the French get on you. You have to have the French that's necessary to really put them off. Lipton remembers the collaboration, the Holocaust, and the sort of the Vichy France, the role Vichy played in sending Jews to the camps, comes to France and looks at it and decides that there's no fundamental difference between the way the French are treating French people of North African descent now and the way they treated Jews in the 1940s. It seems to me a bit of a reach, but what's interesting, I think, is this means that there's a kind of personality trait in the French that doesn't accept otherness. And it's an interesting book, but she feels completely other in France. The last book, Downes, is at least to an academic, is interesting. Downes has essays by 16 historians of France, American and Canadian, mainly American historians of France. Ask them how they became interested in history, how they became interested in France, why this, what's it been like, what's your career been like. And the span is probably a generation and a half, so it's very interesting. You see these people changing, you see France changing, you see the career changing, and it's a very interesting set of essays. And many of them end up in the middle. I didn't feel loved back. I ended up in an imaginary mid-Atlantic space, part insider, always outsider, francophile critique. So there's a kind of ambivalence, which seems to me legitimate in these people. The interesting part is they are specialists on France. Anybody know where this is from? Not you. It's George Washington in the Farewell Address. And it just seems to me quite apt here, particularly in the hatred or fondness, animosity or affection, and the last pair has and in it, duty and interest. So I think it's bringing the two aspects together rather than keeping them separate. Just toss that in. Okay, quick conclusion. Trying to figure out what France's place is going to be in American discourse in the next few years or several years. It seems to me that, to some extent, we have to know whether France's prescience on what was going to happen in Iraq is a kind of a new baseline for relations, as I said, a new seriousness in the way France is approached. Whether America's behavior on the world stage is going to generate countervailing perspectives from other countries like France's. Lord knows there was. In 2003, France was not the only country that didn't want to go along with the U.S., but it was the easiest country to pick on because there is this latent tension vis-a-vis France, I think, in American culture. Another question is whether Europe is going to simply subsume France in terms of identity, in terms of profile, or whether the new Europe is going to be a vehicle for channeling French perspectives. It seems to me it's not decided yet. I should have said earlier, when I talk about this, I don't mean that criticism is unjustified. Criticism of France is unjustified. It's when it goes over the top that it seems to be unacceptable and probably more informative about the criticizer than the criticized. But there's obviously there's plenty to criticize about France. So will Europe subsume French perspective, or will it continue to serve as a vehicle for it? Another is whether the domestic issues in France, unemployment, retirement, healthcare, will generate understanding from Americans or simply scorn, which has often been the case. And finally, whether France will lose its pride of place. It's always already lost, to some extent, its pride of place in the curriculum. What about travel? What about the Security Council? I mean, this is one difference between, say, France and Germany. Germany was faster to criticize or keep its distance from America in 2003. France got criticized, I think, partly because it was easier to criticize France, but it's also because France sits on the Security Council. And it would make ample sense for the French and British seats to become a European seat on in the Security Council and bring in, I don't know, India. I don't predict that's going to happen, but that is part of the pride of place that France enjoys, I think. And so the question is whether France is going to remain distinctive in American eyes, which I think it has been, and whether, if it is still distinctive, whether that's going to be a source of richness for Americans or be seen as subversive. I think what's going to happen is that the critical itch is going to be too strong for Americans not to scratch it where France is concerned, but I think it's probably going to gravitate more towards internal issues in France than international relations. And as I said, many of these internal issues are not that far from America's issues. And I would just end in saying that the U.S. is the new hyperpower. Another source of irritation, because hyperpuissance was a French term, and Americans didn't particularly like the term that's been applied, but that's the way the French look at America. And in that status, I think Americans will need to be able to envision models that aren't perhaps the ones that come to it most immediately, and are going to need to hear things that maybe they don't want to hear. And the sort of question is whether American discourse on France is going to allow that to happen or not. Thank you. Happy to take 90 seconds of questions if you have any. Chris?
Have you charted kind of some of this over, say, the last 20 years? And one of the things that strikes me is certain of your quotes that you had up, we could have plugged in Massachusetts if it had been 1988. When we weren't as interested in international issues, we were more focused on domestic issues. And so I'm wondering in some ways if some of the authors who are criticizing France are just looking for this bogey other. Sometimes it's Massachusetts, sometimes it's France, and that the fact that given the election in 2000, 2004, we were more outward, 2004 we were more outward looking, France became the convenient other for us to criticize, to show our macho manliness, and we were less concerned with Massachusetts.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, that people need a convenient other, and sometimes it's a domestic other, and sometimes it's an international or a foreign other. I would say that France, to me what's specific about France is that it can be both a political and a cultural other. In other words, it works, and that's why I think a lot of this goes back to English attitudes towards France when they were the two imperial powers in Europe. I haven't charted it as closely as you're asking me. 2003 is probably the strongest spike since, I would say, the de Gaulle years. In other words, there was more and more intense criticism of France then than there had been for a generation, I would say, where there was all of this writing in the 1990s that was very favorable to France, but on a personal and a cultural level. So that's not quite an answer, but I think you're right that you need to chart who is the other, but you'd also have to figure out who is looking for another, because I think just most politicians are looking for another in some fashion. Stephen?
I wonder if the way this is divided up, which makes a lot of sense, that the positive is cultural and the negative is political, is a little confusing, because you're not going to have, I think, with respect to culture, a kind of negative side. French wine is no good, or something like that. But in the political realm, presumably there is a positive account as well. What's listed here is pretty much tendentious editorial, polemical writing of a particular sort. And I know that you would recognize that there could be a negative account that's not like that. It doesn't have that sort of tone. I mean, rises above Garrison Keillor, certainly. So that there's a kind of an opportunity for debate. And so I'm wondering whether there's another set of positives in the political realm to match this. In other words, if these are the attacks that are being made on the French position, French strategic.
Well, there's an article. Yeah, there's an article from 2003 titled "The French Were Right," for example, which I did find. But the initiative belonged to the negatives, and the others came to kind of counteract that. And they weren't books. These are, 5 books in the space of a year and a half struck me as quite a bit. But in a way, what I'm saying is that the newspapers talking about political France, and that's why I want to end with the presidential elections, really very sober, which is not a positive necessarily, but given some of the past treatment, neutrality is very positive, right? Because it's not as strongly negative. But there's another issue, another thing you could chart, which is, are you talking about reportage? Are you talking about personal columns? Are you talking about op-eds? I haven't done that too well. The people I mentioned, Cohen and Vinokur, write what I would call columns, which would be, I wouldn't call Tom Frieden an op-ed, for example. To me, op-ed is just occasional by somebody, even though it's on the op-ed page. Not to quarrel about that, but these are people who are writing the way Tom Friedman would write, but they write almost solely, Vinokur writes solely on France, Cohen will write on Europe. But that kind of distinction has to be made too, and I can't track it that well. When I say that the reporting was really quite straightforward over the course of this spring and even before, I'm talking about more about articles than I am about columns. No, you're absolutely right, but negatives on the cultural side are frankly pretty hard to come by. You'll get condescension. You'll get remarks about American movies, French movies. Everybody knows they don't end up any place. They're murky, and if you can't understand them, that's considered to be deep. That sort of thing. And it is condescension, but it doesn't last very long, and it's nowhere near as negative as the political side. John.
Is there much of a linkage that is made between the French, the notion that France has the criticism of the French position about the war, Iraq War, was in fact, when Americans take off after the French, is it ever a combination of saying not only are they snide in their attitude towards the war, but the real reason is because they have this cradle-to-grave socialism which has made them somehow weak? In other words, is there a connection ever made between the political criticism of the French system and their attitude towards the war?
Yeah, I don't know how you express it. I think they would be seen as both descending from some other personality defect rather than one causing the other. You see what I mean? In other words, it's a chain like that, and so sometimes that kind of defect leads to 35-hour work week, and sometimes it leads to disloyal conduct vis-a-vis America. But I don't think one causes the other. I think they both go back to an earlier insufficiency at some level.
And there's no attempt to link the two.
Not that I know.
Separate criticism.
No, I don't think so. The link is that they're both French.
There are 2 policy areas that the Americans could probably find to criticize, additional ones that criticize the French on. One an old one, one a new one. The old one is a common agricultural policy, and at least from a policy perspective, and it didn't show up in your presentation. It's one policy criticism of France. France supporting the policy that benefits French farmers, and also, by the way, preserves the French way of life in many ways. The second question that I think I would be surprised if it doesn't show up in the future, if it hasn't showed up in the literature yet, is the criticism of France for joining Germany and Belgium and a few other NATO countries and taking the safe jobs in Afghanistan, while Canadians, the U.S., the Brits, and a few others take the dangerous ones and take the casualties. Have you seen anything on either of those issues in the literature recently?
No. The books we're talking about could have talked about Afghanistan, but at that point, Afghanistan redounded to the opposite position. That is, the French are with us in Afghanistan. I mean, you're talking about a subsequent issue, I think. But they didn't want to say that France is with us in Afghanistan because that weakened their argument in general. No, you see it appear. I mean, and remember, I'm less concerned about criticism than I am about hypercriticism or bashing. Certainly, the common agricultural policy would go in the direction of too much protectionism, fear of globalization, all that stuff. And that would be, I would consider that a domestic issue that I'm talking about that may well continue, because it's certainly true that many of the Americans that criticize France see it as not open enough, favoring equality over freedom, that sort of thing, protecting a way of life that they want to see change. And they're behind the European curve. I mean, many of the countries that have basically the same socio-political outlook that France does have made changes about retirement, about unemployment, and that sort of thing. And France hasn't, and certainly the common agricultural policy. But that's a good example, too. Vermont's in favor of a common agricultural policy. There are many resemblances between Vermont and France, so that you can find equivalents. And that doesn't mean somebody who's writing about France is going to find them or choose to find them, but there are links, I think. Rohatyn?
If you compare the type of American Francophobia in history, for example, I know that when Charles de Gaulle asked me to leave the headquarters in France because he moved to France from the military command, there was a lot of American Francophobia at that time in boycotting your French product. So is this worse than, for example, this period? Or?
I haven't really read up on it. I think probably. I think it was probably worse in 2003. What you have is a kind of a transmedia onslaught in 2003 with all of the comedian. I mean, if you look at Miquelon, which you probably have, the late night humor and all this stuff, it was what do you call it, open season on France. And nobody to say, wait a minute, for example, you wouldn't talk about any other people or any other country that way. I mean, if you take some of these sentences, you wouldn't put Jew in there, you wouldn't put Mexican in there, you wouldn't put woman in there, but it's, you have free reign. What would be interesting, I think, if you go back there, is to see how much of that was aimed at de Gaulle and how much was aimed at France. I think it was probably more at de Gaulle than it was, and the French were following. But whereas what you got now in many of this, as I say, is a kind of essentialization of a French character trait that manifests itself in behavior that is reprehensible. Keith?
Back to the pop culture side, chick lit is becoming a big part of the positives, especially in the last few years. But doesn't that, you think, in some way maybe make Americans' attitudes that French is more marginalized? The reason to go to Paris is to find a cute guy, drink some wine, and that tends to somewhat shunt France off to the margins a bit more.
Maybe. I mean, you're right. The final episode of Sex and the City is in Paris. There are a lot of these things that end in Paris or take place in Paris. I don't know whether it's marginalized. I think it runs along with the other stuff. I'm not quite sure whether this relates. There was almost nothing in this last batch of writing about redoing a house compared to 10 years previously, and more about marrying somebody French or having kids in France and watching the kids be French, and what does that do to France? We'd have to look at this stuff because I mean that's one of the things that irritates me about a lot of these blogs is it's so ephemeral and there's so much fashion and shoes and stuff in it. I can't do it. I just can't do it. But you'd have to sort out. I'm talking about nonfiction, and the blogs are somewhere between nonfiction and chick lit, if you see what I mean. You know, if you follow me, so we'd have to. I don't know what difference it makes to a reader to know that it's either fiction or nonfiction, but I think it would be worth starting with that distinction and seeing whether you can maintain it or not. Nick?
I was, just to go back a bit, I was thinking in answer to the question Stephen asked, that recently there have been two extremely favorable articles, one by William Pfaff in the, I think, next to last New York Review, pointing out that it was the European Union that brought the Soviet Empire down, not Mr. Reagan, and admittedly he's talking about more than France. And then this rather nostalgic piece about Chirac that came out in the New York Times the other day, and how we'll miss it when he's gone.
Yeah, Tony Judd, yeah.
Now, Tony Judd, does this portend a kind of a new wave of pro-Frenchism? Or?
I doubt it. I think, Pfaff is as reliable in his way as Cohen and Vinokur are in there. I mean, and there's a quote here. So that's not new. Plus, I wouldn't expect a New York Review of Books to be particularly anti-French or Francophobe, sort of thing. I thought the Judd piece was kind of a curious thing to run in the Times. It wasn't really about the elections. It was about what the elections are replacing. And it was, but you're right. And a reminder, there are two paragraphs there. I mean, I have two paragraphs saying, wait a minute, you hear bad things about France, but the kids are better educated, they're healthier, it costs less, people live longer, they live better, but all as a way of saying Chirac wasn't that bad. I'm not sure Chirac is responsible for what he was listing as the pluses of life in France, but it was almost a contrarian piece. I thought I was surprised by it. I don't know. I think that's contingent because there are elections, and Pfaff is like that. That's what Pfaff writes about France and about Europe. So I don't see anything new there. Dave.
Thanks. That was really very interesting. Another Stephen follow-on question. Your cover slide title here made me wonder about what's happened to the long-standing literature on assimilation. That is to say, McCarthy-era artists, writers, even going back to the French colonial period in North America, where French settlers, the record clearly shows that they assimilated with indigenous peoples in terms of marriage to a much greater extent than did the British. And I'm wondering, my question is this, is that literature, is that voice, as it were, in literature is it not there, or is it being suppressed by an increasingly homogenized press that wants to give us what we want to hear?
Okay, so the American press on French assimilation or French assimilability? I'm not sure I follow the question.
Within this country, there's widespread knowledge, as Stephen, I think, was alluding to, that there is a long history of assimilation in France of outsiders. Chris's original question. And I'm wondering, are people not writing about that, or is it just not being published in the popular media?
Well, that's one issue. No, there's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And none of what I'm talking about is eternal. I've been scolded at home for spending time on this literature when there were better things to read. But I'm not sure this literature would talk about that anyway. You do get what you get. Well, the closest thing would be the scarf episode. In other words, the ban on ostentatious religious symbols in schools. And what I saw in the American press was more understanding of the issues than I would have expected it to be, because there's a kind of facile secularism in France the same way there's a kind of a facile multiculturalism in this country, and that they aren't made to understand one another. Right. But these articles were pretty good about it. That's not a full answer to your question, but
it just occurred to me because we make a big deal about the riots, but we don't look at the other historical things that happened in France, which really were that put a different edge on that.
Well, yeah, I don't know what happened to my slide, but on the riots, the comment, my reservation about what I saw on the riots was what was not in there, which was the history of French assimilation. Also, Hurricane Katrina didn't make it in there in terms of how minorities are dealt with. And that might have been an interesting comparison. And the best article I saw was by a black American, actually, on the riots. Much more balanced and this sort of thing. But I wonder whether, other than when something pops up like the ban on symbols, I think what you're asking about would be academic writing rather than popular writing. I may be wrong, but you also don't see that much about French assimilation in sub-Saharan Africa or Maghreb over colonial history. That's.
So the McCarthy dissidents and the black writers and the musicians, nobody's standing up for France in this debate.
Well, it's a very different generation now. The only black writer I'm familiar with in France writes detective stories, and I think it's a different America that they're going to be reacting to, and so they look for other things in France than they would have looked for in the 40s. Yes, George.
And how many of these books would be available in France? Would they be read, and what would be the reaction to them?
The reaction is, well, no. Many of them would be available. Many of them, I'm embarrassed to say, the haphazard way this bibliography has come to be is embarrassing. But many of them I found in France at an English language bookshop, because that's a ready-made public. Most of them haven't been translated, which is the way. In fiction, what's her name? What is her name? L'affaire, le divorce. Diane Johnson, thank you. Diane Johnson, from what I've seen, is considered a curiosity. It's not. They don't see this stuff as really telling. Peter Mailer, who would have launched in some ways this literature, is also looked on as a curiosity, I think. Isn't it interesting that someone would be this interested in village life in France? But now what they talk about is what happened to the village. The village was filled with Japanese tour buses constantly. They finally basically invited mail to leave town. I should have mentioned too that there's a lot of this American writing. There's a lot of British writing on France. It's very much like this configuration. And there's a lot of American writing on Tuscany now. I have about 15 books of this kind writing about Tuscany. So it's so it's not really available to that extent, and just I think kind of a curiosity. Thank you again. P.S. I don't know what this means. In January, I found a collection of New Yorker cartoons published in France, dealing with France and the French, and all the captions are in French. So it's been done in France, but not here, which I don't know what that says, but.